Hello everyone, Panzer J back with a new video. This video is going to be on Axis and Allies Pacific, World War II strategy game set obviously in the Pacific. The playable countries in this game are going to be Japan, China, the United States, and the British. And the British in this game encompass the Australians, the Far East Command, also some of the Dutch territories are controlled by the British. Now, this isn't a game I've actually played yet, so I can't really go over strategy so much or actually the gameplay. I thought we'd just kind of look at it a little bit. It's set up to the opening turn of the game, and we can kind of just look at the map and the units and how things are set up. And then I also have Xeno games Pacific at War set up side by side. So I thought at the end maybe we can kind of look at both games, compare the two. They are very comparable. There are a few differences, but overall the Xeno Pacific at War, again, obviously is set in the Pacific during World War II, and you have the same playable countries and a lot of the same units. So the feel for the games are very similar. So we'll take a look at both of them side by side and kind of compare them a little bit. But this game is set, ANA's Pacific is set before Japan has really gotten aggressive. They do own a couple of Chinese territories at the beginning of the game here. If you can see up by Manchuria and Korea. So they're into China a little bit at the start of this game, but they haven't really, other than China, they haven't really went after any of the other allies yet. The United States, down here in the Philippines, and then over by Hawaii and off the western coast of the United States, they're not in this conflict yet, and neither is the British. The British are represented by the tan units here, down through Australia, the Money Islands, and up to India. The Chinese are represented by the darker brown units. The Japanese are the red, and then the United States is the like olive green. They also do have some darker green, which represent Marines. But that's how the map looks at the beginning. So Japan definitely has quite a bit of naval power on the board. And if we look over here by Midway, we've got three fully loaded Japanese carriers. So 3 carriers with a total of 6 fighters and a sub. So I imagine this is supposed to represent the Japanese carrier force that the Americans engaged at the Battle of Midway in May of 42. So, which the Japanese lost. They lost all 4 carriers in that battle. The U.S. lost 2, but definitely came out ahead. The Japanese do also have some more naval units over here by Guam and by the Caroline Islands, a battleship, 3 total transports, a couple of destroyers, and a sub. So Japan is definitely positioned at the start of this game to possibly go after the U.S. like right away. Again, I haven't played this, so I'm not sure exactly how that kind of strategy would work for Japan, but they definitely have the naval power on this side of the Pacific to go after the U.S. right away. The U.S. can counter with, in Hawaii, you got a couple of battleships, a destroyer, and a transport. So definitely Japan's got more than enough to take out those naval units by Hawaii at the beginning of the game. But then you'd have to worry if you're Japan, the U.S. does have a bunch of stuff that could come back. Like we've got a fully loaded carrier and a destroyer over here by Samoa. And then up off the coast, the west coast of the United States, you've got a carrier with 1 fighter, a couple of destroyers, and a sub. plus some air power in the western United States as well. So you would think that even though Japan would probably have a fairly easy go at taking out these naval units in Hawaii, the U.S. could then counterattack with quite a bit of stuff and possibly wipe out that entire Japanese fleet. And Japan would be kind of left with not a whole heck of a lot on this side of the board as far as like naval units go. So, like I said, who knows? I haven't actually played, but that could be one strategy Japan pursues. As far as on the left side of the Pacific here, again, they have quite a few naval units. They got a fully loaded carrier, a battleship, and a destroyer off of Hong Kong. And then they've got a destroyer, a battleship, a sub, and some transports in Japan itself. Now, one thing you notice about, especially the Japanese naval units, they got a shit ton of transports on the board to start. So you got 3 up here, 2 here, 2 here. That's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Looks like we got like 12 Japanese transports on the board to start. So Japan is definitely able to move ground units around right from the start. So that gives Japan a lot of versatility in terms of where they might want to go. The ability to pick up and land in a bunch of these islands down in the South Pacific right away on turn 1. And they do have quite a few ground units in Japan itself. You got a stack, I think it's about 8 guys, a couple artillery and a tank, as well as a bunch of infantry over here off of this island as well. So, and that's what Japan has to do. They have to be aggressive and go after the Allies pretty much right from the start. They can win militarily as well as economically. Again, I haven't played this, so I might not represent the rules exactly, but from what I've read, Japan can also win by victory points. So for every $10 worth of territory Japan has, they get 1 victory point. So they start out at $19 worth of territories, and so that would be worth 1 victory point. There's no rounding up in this game when you're calculating Japan's victory points. So if Japan, for instance, on turn 1, went on the offensive and took, let's say, another $11 worth of territory, that put them at $30, which means at the end of turn 1, they would collect 3 victory points. And this chart over here is used both to calculate the victory points for Japan as well as just the national production. So here's at the bottom is the victory points chart. So let's say under that scenario, they were at 30. They start out at $19 here. Let's say they make their way up to $30 at the end of turn 1. They collect their 3 victory points down here, and they need 22 victory points for the economic, in essence, victory for Japan. So at that point, they would be 19 victory points away, and it's cumulative. So like the next turn, so at the end of turn 1, Japan's at $30 under this scenario. Let's say they take another $15 on turn 2. That's up to 45. They would collect 4 more victory points, put them at 7 at the end of turn 2, and so on. So that's probably the best case scenario for a Japanese victory. I think it would be harder militarily to defeat the Allies, just because you really, as Japan, probably have no chance at all of taking out the Western United States. So the U.S. is going to constantly be in this, and their economic power. I mean, again, if we just look at this chart, they start turn 1, $75. So that's nearly 4 times what Japan starts the game with. So you're probably not going to take out the United States. China, you probably got a decent shot of taking out the Chinese, but they're not exactly an economic power. None of those territories are worth a whole heck of a lot. And for the British, you might be able to get close to Calcutta, India, but it'd probably be maybe 50-50 if you can actually take out India itself, as well as Australia down here. So I think it would be more difficult for Japan to win this game militarily. I think they're going to probably have to go for the victory points. So that's kind of how the victory points work for Japan. So because of that, they're going to have to go on the offensive right away and kind of even throw caution to the wind maybe and get a little risky with some of their moves, because they've got to, while they have the military advantage to start the game with the units they have on the board, because of the United States' economic power, that is going to shift quickly. So they need to take advantage of what they've got going on in turn one. And realistically, starting out at $19, you're going to probably have to take upwards of $21 worth of territories on turn one. That puts you at $40 and 4 victory points. That's really where you want to sit after the first turn, and then just keep building from there. I would think that you're going to probably have to average 3 to 4 victory points per turn, at least through the first, say, 4 or 5 turns, to really put yourself in a position to win by the victory points condition. Just because, again, the United States' economic power is going to start being felt within a couple of turns, and the pushback is going to start as far as like losing territory and the U.S. coming across the Pacific. Who knows, maybe even making a push for Japan itself, or at the very least pushing back on some of these islands, maybe helping out the Australians if they're in trouble and whatnot. So you've got to go, as the Japanese, you got to go fast, you got to go hard, and take and scoop up all of those money territories that you can. As far as like the units in the game, it's very similar to Xeno Games Pacific at War. Not as many different units as the Global War games or even subsequent Axis and Allies, but you got a decent selection. For the Air Force units, you've got bombers and fighters, and those are the only 2 air units. For naval, you've got destroyers, battleships, transports, submarines, and carriers. So 5 different naval units. And in this game, unlike the Xeno Games Pacific at War, carriers do hold 2 planes instead of 1. And then for ground units, you've got infantry, you got artillery, you got tanks, and then the U.S. also has the additional ground unit of Marines, which are represented by these darker green units. And then you also have industrial complexes and anti-aircraft guns. So not too bad as far as the selection of units that you have to play with in the game. Again, a little less complex than what you're going to find in some of the other games that are out there. As far as like die rolls, you're also only using 6-sided die in this game, as opposed to historical board gaming's Global War, where you use 12-sided. So if we look at this chart over here, this is the attacker-defender chart. So I'm using only 6-sided die. Obviously, you have attack and defense values are lower. So like infantry and Marines, they attack at a 1. Artillery and subs at a 2. Tanks, fighters, and destroyers 3. And then bombers and battleship at 4. And again, that's on a 6-sided die. We also have here, take a look at the setup charts. Each country, here's Japan here. And they also have unique things, like Japan has kamikaze attacks. So there's the Japanese setup chart. And then we got the United States, and China is with the United States. And then we've got India/Australia, which is in essence the British. So that's a look at the setup charts for each country. Unique to this game, I hadn't seen this really before, was the Japanese units are in red. So that's a little different. Usually they're orange or yellowish color. The U.S. are in their normal olive green, the British in tan, and then the Chinese in the darker brown. So that's a little bit different too. I'm not sure. I've seen the Chinese units represented with that color before. So that's different. The red units, I actually use these red Japanese infantry and the red Japanese fighters as the veteran units in the Global War series of games. I had those pieces actually before I even purchased this game, and then had been using those to represent the veteran units for the Japanese. So, and the sculpts are pretty good. I mean, most of them are standard sculpts that you'll find in various versions of at least the Axis and Allies games. The Japanese battleship is like a heavier Yamato class battleship, but and sometimes the Japanese are represented by not this heavy battleship sculpt. But other than that, most everything else is standard for Japanese. The infantry, the transports, the subs, all of that you'll find throughout some Axis and Allies games. Same thing with the British. Really, you got the Spitfire represented for the fighter sculpt, standard infantry, artillery. All that looks pretty standard. Same thing with the U.S. as well. Really nothing different. I did notice, though, they've got the heavy bombers here, which are just called bombers. And the U.S. actually is represented by two different fighters. I believe that might be a Hellcat naval fighter, and then you've got the P-38 Lightning. So I'm not sure why the U.S. has two different fighter sculpts. I mean, the Japanese also have carrier-based fighters and land-based fighters, but they're represented by the same. If you take a look there, they're represented by the same sculpt. It's the same fighter, the Japanese Zero. So I'm not sure exactly why the U.S. has two different fighter sculpts. I don't know if they perform differently. Again, I haven't actually played the game yet, so maybe I'll get deeper into the rules and have an answer for you. But that's kind of cool. I mean, I like having the more sculpts, the better, I think. So that's kind of a look at Axis and Allies Pacific. And then if we kind of pan out, so we've got Xeno Games Pacific at War set up next to ANA's Pacific. And if you look, things are pretty similar across the board. Xeno Games, they do have a bigger map, which I think is really cool. I like the added spaces, especially the Pacific Ocean being represented by more spaces. I think that gives you an added dimension to the gameplay. You got to strategize a little bit differently. I like that it takes you more turns to get where you want to go just because you've got more spaces in between the territories you want to get to. So I think that's cool. As you can see, the Axis and Allies map a little bit smaller. But both maps or both games have the same countries involved: Japan, China, US, and the British. And as far as the units involved, that's also very similar. There's not a lot different there. There's 2 air units in each game, 5 naval units in each game, and the 3 ground units in each game. And both games also have factories. The only difference for the Xeno games, you don't have AA guns. The sculpt for them is an anti-aircraft gun sculpt, but that functions as artillery in the Xeno Pacific at War game, as opposed to the Pacific from Axis and Allies that has both artillery and actually AA guns. But other than that, the units are pretty much the same. Sculpts are a little bit different. Xeno games, kind of more generic sculpts. They have basically the same sculpts for each country, just colored different. So the U.S. is the darker green here, the Japanese, the orange, light orange, the Chinese, the green, dark green or bright green, and then the British again are these brown colored. So you won't see as much authenticity as far as the sculpts go. They're just going to be generic for each country across the board. But then, also in Pacific at War, you can win economically and militarily, just like in A&A's Pacific. So that's similar. So both games have quite a bit of similarities. Again, they're obviously focusing on the same theater of war in World War II, and again have the same combatants represented. So if you're familiar with one, the other game is going to come pretty easy to you as far as learning the mechanics and the gameplay. So that's a look at both games side by side. Hopefully be able to get into one of these games fairly soon here and maybe post a video on the actual gameplay and how it turned out. My thoughts for these two games, I think for both of them, Japan would be more of a challenge to play. I think trying to secure a Japanese victory would be a little bit harder than, say, the pulling out a victory as the Allies, especially in the Xeno games Pacific at War. I think Japan doesn't look quite as strong for sure in terms of their naval units. So I think Japan would even have a more difficult time in the Xeno games, whereas in the Axis and Allies Pacific, Japan starts out with much more naval power, and even as far as ground units, I think Japan has a little bit more in the A&A version. So if you're shooting for a Japanese victory, I think you'd have more of a chance in the A&A version, but I think either one of them would definitely be more challenging playing as Japan. So we'll see. Maybe get a couple of guys over here and see if we can get one of these games played. And we'll be back, hopefully, with a gameplay video for you guys. Take care, and we'll see you soon.